Have you ever had a project that you left unfinished for literally months because you didn't know how to finish it? Well, today, my friends, I am actually tackling one of those projects. This is my hand embroidery thread painting that I started over the summertime, and you may have remembered it from many videos. And originally, I was going to finish it like I normally do a lot of my hand embroidery projects where I just put it in a hoop, call it good, and hang it on my wall or, have like a little stand for it. But today, I thought I'd do something a little different. Let's get into it. You may remember this thread painting from over the summer. I worked on it on and off for a few months, starting when I was on vacation in the desert. I added the last few stitches recently, some spikes on the cactus, and a little bit of shadowing to make it really pop. My original plan was to leave it in the hoop, but the more I looked at it, the more I realized that this design deserves to stand on its own. So instead, I'm turning it into a small quilted wall hanging using the quilt-as-you-go technique. This is a simple, beginner-friendly technique and a great way to use up fabric scraps. Have you ever tried quilt as you go before? Let me know in the comments. I love hearing your favorite methods to finishing up projects. Since this thread painting had been living in its hoop for the last couple of months, it deserved a lot of ironing. And when I say a lot of ironing, this actually took maybe like 10 minutes to get it to lie flat, but I'll save you from watching me iron for 10 minutes and just speed this up. Then I prepped all the scrap fabric that I'm going to use as the borders. There's a couple of colors, and I got all this fabric secondhand at an estate sale over the summertime. After all my fabric was ironed, then I got to cutting. The first thing that I cut was the batting, and I decided that I wanted a square that was going to be approximately 12 by 12 inches. I first did a rough cut, and then I cleaned it up with my rotary cutter. And because this is a quilt as you go project, I'm going to be sewing the thread painting directly onto the batting. And so I wanted to make sure that it was relatively centered on the batting here before moving any further. Once I was satisfied with the placement, I pinned it in place and then I started cutting all the scrap pieces of fabric that are going to act as the different borders around the thread painting. I'm using three different colors for the borders and they're all cut with 2-inch widths and they're of various sizes. I didn't really care how long they were because they were going to get cut up anyway. When using the quilt as you go technique, you sew the strip of fabric on with the right side facing down, then you flip it right side up, press, and then repeat that process until you've got the size that you'd like. You can see that here. I'm just trying to figure out the placement before I actually sew everything on. The right side is facing down, and then I cut off the excess just to make it a little bit easier, and then I do that process over and over again. The most important step of this entire process is actually the pressing that goes on in between putting each new piece of fabric on. So just imagine that I'm actually pressing every time I finish sewing a new piece on. I just didn't show you that process because I didn't want to have to keep moving my camera, and this was just a little bit easier for me to get this project done. By the way, did you know that I have a newsletter? I send it every week, and it's a brief little peek behind the scenes of what I'm working on in the studio, recaps of the videos that I've posted that week, and usually I send out my weekly recommendation, which includes either a tool or sometimes even a book that I've loved that week. My newsletter is another way that I like to stay connected, and I'd love for you to join. There is a link in the description if you're interested. Okay, so you may have also noticed that I am not just like sewing these quilt as you go strips on in a square, but really I'm just sort of making a circle around the thread painting. I thought this looked a little bit better and more interesting to the eye because of the actual thread painting being a circle in itself. I think it's coming out pretty good, but it took a lot more time than I was expecting because each little bit was it was a lot. But I love how it's coming out, and I'm about to add the orange now too. When I was finished with the orange border, then I put on a border of yellow fabric, and I also had to make sure that the corner edges were squared up. But I wasn't paying too much attention to how it looked on the outside because I knew I was going to square up everything afterward. I really love this part because it's when everything is just sort of starting to come together, and cutting off all that excess fabric just gives it this like really nice fresh look. I ended up cutting it a little bit smaller than the original 12 by 12. I think it ended up being about 11.5 by 11 or so. And that's okay because the next part is going to be adding binding to it, and it's going to be the same color yellow as the outside. So it will actually look a little bit bigger on the top and the bottom where I cut off a little too much of the yellow. But before putting the binding on, I needed to cut a back piece of fabric, which I probably should have done at the same time that I was cutting off the excess, but I forgot about it, so I'm doing it here now. After that process, it was time to start the binding. I'm still really new to bindings, but here's how I generally make mine. I cut a square piece of fabric. Mine happens to be about 12 by 12 inches. And next I cut the square in half. Except here, I accidentally cut my piece of fabric a little bit too small, as you see me deliberating here. So then I went back, I ironed, and then I cut another piece that was actually 12 by 12 inches. Next, I cut the square in half to form two triangles, and then I sewed those two triangles together to make a rhombus. In the middle of sewing this, I realized that I was almost completely out of thread from my giant spool that I've had for months and months and months and months, and this was just the end of it. So I decided to see if it would actually hold its tension and get me to the end of this seam because I didn't want to waste anything, and magically it did. I don't recommend doing this at home, but it worked out for me. Once you're done with that seam, you're going to take your rhombus back to the ironing board, press, make sure that it's completely flat, and then we're going to draw lines on the right side of the fabric. This is really important because you're going to be cutting on these lines later. And I usually make them spaced 2 inches apart, but because I want really thin bias binding tape here, I'm actually doing 1.5 inch width between each line. And you'll notice at the end, I actually had a little bit left over and I just cut it off.
Anywhere you go, you belong. Anywhere you said, anywhere you said, anywhere.
After you're finished with that, you're going to sew the rhombus edges together, making sure that you match up the lines you just drew on the fabric. This is a really tedious part, and I suggest just going slow. The rhombus is going to be a really weird shape afterwards, and you're going to make sure that there is a little bit hanging over on the front and the back edge of that, so it's not completely together. You're gonna sew with the same seam allowance that you use on the first seam, and here I am using a 1/4 inch seam. but I also forgot that I ran out of thread and I had to put a new spool in. This spool is giant and I didn't realize it, but the thread's a little bit thicker than my other one, but it seemed to be working okay. Once you're done sewing, it's time to flip right side out so that you can see your lines, and then you're just going to cut on those lines all the way around and around and around so that you make one strip. I really enjoy making bias tape or binding tape this way because it means I only have to actually sew two seams and I just cut those seams making one long strip as opposed to sewing multiple seams together. I just find this way to be fun and enjoyable and really easy and super gratifying when you cut one strip and it comes out like this. Then you're going to take your binding tool. This one creates a 5/8 inch bias tape, and you're going to thread one end through the large end, and then you're going to press the fabric and pull the tool to fold more. That sounds really confusing, so I'm just going to show you how to do it here. This is a super easy process when you have a good hot iron, a wool pressing pad like the one that I have here, and the bias tape tool. My tool came in a pack of 5 and they all work really well. They're super simple and they're very, very affordable. If you're interested in any of the tools that I'm using here, there's a link in my description to my Amazon storefront. Oh, and I forgot to mention that after you do the initial fold with the tool, you're going to have to fold the folds onto each other to create the binding bias tape. Sort of a long process, but the tool really speeds it up from my previous method. And then it was time to sew the bias binding tape onto my little wall hanging. I really like contrasting binding, but for this particular wall hanging, I decided to use the same yellow fabric as the last border piece, and I really like how it came out. Overall, I really enjoyed this project, and I'm even more excited that it's finished and I get to hang it up on my wall. My studio is finally starting to feel like a reflection of me and my vibe, and it's not just another blank white wall. If you've made it this far, thank you for spending a little creative time with me today. Let me know in the comments what's one unfinished project you'd love to bring back to life this season. Maybe we can all tackle a work in progress to wall art moment together. If you liked this video, it would mean so much if you gave it a thumbs up. It really helps more cozy makers find this channel, and of course, don't forget to subscribe if you want to follow along as I start my next big project, which is a scrappy patchwork jacket made entirely from scrap fabric. Thanks again for watching, and remember, done is better than perfect.